My name is Walter Mackenzie, and at 63 years old, I thought I understood the difference between a person's character and their performance. 37 years of running a small furniture restoration workshop in Barrie, Ontario, will teach you that. Wood doesn't lie. You strip back the varnish, and you see exactly what you're working with: rot or solid grain, weakness or something that will last another 100 years. I thought I'd gotten good at reading people the same way. I was wrong about Diane, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it matters. My wife, Carol, passed away in the spring of 2019 after 29 years of marriage. Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to the end was 11 weeks, which is not enough time to say everything you need to say to someone. Not enough time to prepare yourself. Not enough time for any of it. My son, Patrick, drove up from Toronto the moment we got the news, and my daughter, Renee, flew in from Vancouver. We held together through the funeral and the weeks that followed. And then life did what it always does. It pulled everyone back to their own corners. Patrick had his family, Renee had her career, and I had a workshop full of Victorian wardrobes and Georgian writing desks that needed attention. Work saved me, honestly. There's something about putting your hands on something broken and making it whole again that keeps the worst thoughts at bay. My workshop sits behind the house on a half-acre property I've owned since 1991. The house and the land are held through a numbered company I set up years ago on my accountant's advice, a straightforward arrangement for tax purposes that I never gave much thought to. The workshop carries a separate business registration. To anyone who didn't know the paperwork, it looked like I was simply a craftsman who rented space and a home from some faceless corporation. That detail would matter later more than I ever imagined. By 2022, 3 years after losing Carol, my children were quietly, diplomatically trying to encourage me to get out more. Renee called every Sunday and always found a way to mention community groups or evening classes. Patrick mentioned a neighbor of his who'd started attending a grief support circle and found it useful. I resisted for months. I wasn't ready, and I think part of me felt that being ready would be some kind of betrayal of Carol's memory. But loneliness has a way of wearing you down. In September of 2022, I started attending a woodworking and craft circle that met at a community center in Barrie on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. It wasn't grief support, and it wasn't a singles group. It was just people making things with their hands, which suited me perfectly. I brought a small project each week, a dovetail box, a carved panel, and I sat at a long table with retired teachers and former nurses, and a semi-retired plumber named Gordon, who became one of my better friends. That's where I met Diane Sorensen. She was 61 at the time, a recently retired administrative coordinator from a school board office. She was tall, composed, and had the kind of dry, quiet humor that took a few sessions to notice, but once you did, you looked forward to it every week. She was working on hand-painted ceramic tiles, which she gave away as gifts. I helped her once when the grout she was using was too thick for what she wanted, and she thanked me with such genuine warmth that I found myself thinking about the exchange on the drive home. We were friends for 4 months before anything shifted. I want to be precise about that timeline because it matters. 4 months of Tuesday and Thursday evenings, the occasional coffee afterward with a group of us, a few conversations in the parking lot that ran longer than they should have. She'd been divorced for 9 years. Her ex-husband, she rarely elaborated, had been financially irresponsible in ways that had cost her considerably. She'd rebuilt her life carefully. She owned a condo in Innisfil, drove a sensible car, and lived, by her own description, very modestly. By January 2023, we were seeing each other outside the craft circle. Dinners at local restaurants, a Saturday drive to Collingwood, a Sunday afternoon at the art gallery. It was gentle and unhurried, and I was grateful for that. I wasn't looking to replace Carol. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. But companionship is a real need, and Diane was good company. I told her early on that I worked in furniture restoration. I told her I'd been at it for decades and that the workshop was behind the house I lived in. I told her the house and workshop were part of a company arrangement and that I was technically a tenant of that company, which was the simplified version of a truth that would have taken 20 minutes of corporate structure explanation to convey properly. She nodded and didn't ask further questions. I didn't volunteer more. That was my first mistake, though not in the way you might think. What I didn't tell her, what I told no one, outside of my accountant and my lawyer and my children, was that I was the sole director and shareholder of that numbered company. that I owned the property outright, that the workshop's client list included some of the most respected antique dealers in Ontario, a handful of collectors in Quebec, and 2 auction houses in Toronto that sent me pieces they didn't trust to anyone else. That the business, modest as it looked from the outside, was worth considerably more than a craftsman's income might suggest. I want to be honest about why I kept this quiet. It wasn't a calculated test. Not at first. After Carol died, I'd had 2 uncomfortable situations, not relationships exactly, more like advances from women who'd heard through mutual acquaintances that I owned property. The attention felt wrong. It felt like being looked at for the wrong reasons. When Diane came into my life and seemed to like me for the company I kept and the conversation I offered, I found I didn't want to disturb that by putting numbers and properties into the picture. I told myself I'd tell her everything when the time was right. The time, as it turned out, was chosen for me. We got engaged on a Saturday evening in July 2023. I'd cooked dinner at the house rack of lamb, Carol's old recipe, which I made for the first time for someone else with a complicated heart. I had a ring that had belonged to my mother, a simple gold band with a small diamond that Carol had always admired from a distance. Diane cried when I asked. She said yes 3 times, as though once wasn't enough. I believed her completely. The following Sunday, 8 days after I proposed, I was in the workshop by 7 in the morning, which is my habit. I had a rosewood sideboard on the bench that needed careful attention to a section of veneer lifting along the top rail. The morning light was good and I was focused on the work. I heard the workshop door open at 9:30. I turned around and found Diane standing in the doorway. She was not dressed for a Sunday visit. She was dressed for business, a structured blazer I didn't recognize, her posture different from the Diane I knew. Standing slightly behind her were 2 people I'd never seen before, a man in his mid-30s with a leather portfolio under his arm, and a woman perhaps a few years younger wearing an expression of polite neutrality. "These are my children," Diane said. "Gregory and Fiona." I set down my tools. I remember wiping my hands on my work apron and thinking, odd time and odd way to introduce them. But hello. Gregory opened the portfolio before either of us had exchanged pleasantries. He laid 3 documents on my workbench right on top of the rosewood sideboard without asking, which I noticed. The first was a business profile he'd apparently compiled about the workshop. The second was what appeared to be a draft operating agreement for a new company. The third was a letter, addressed to me. Diane spoke before I could read anything. She said she'd been doing some thinking since the engagement. She said she'd spoken with Gregory and Fiona, and they all agreed that at her stage of life, she needed proper financial security. She said she understood I was a tenant here, and that the property belonged to a company, and that she'd had Gregory look into the company's registration. Gregory looked up from the portfolio and informed me, with the careful tone of someone delivering news they expect to be unwelcome, that the registered company appeared to have been inactive in certain filing respects, and that there were, in his words, some questions about the continuity of the lease arrangement I had with the property. I said nothing. I let him continue. He said that, as Diane's future husband, I would presumably be listing her on whatever residential documents applied. He said they'd prepared a simple agreement. He tapped the draft operating agreement that would bring Diane on as an equal partner in the workshop business, with her name added to the business registration. He framed this as a reasonable protection for her. Fiona spoke for the first time. She said, gently, that they weren't trying to cause any trouble. They just wanted Mum to be looked after. I picked up the letter. It was a formal document, clearly prepared by someone with some legal training, though not, I suspected, an actual lawyer. It was addressed to me as the current occupant and workshop operator, and it outlined a transition arrangement under which Diane would become co-owner of the business operations and would be listed as a co-applicant on any lease renewal. It referenced a clause about common law property rights under Ontario law. It was signed by Gregory on behalf of what appeared to be a numbered company he had incorporated himself within the previous 30 days. I noticed the registration date in a header on one of the accompanying pages. I set the letter back down. I asked Diane to look at me. She did, though her eyes moved quickly away. I said, "I need you to understand something. This is not how a person who loves someone behaves. This is not a conversation you bring lawyers or people pretending to be lawyers to have in someone's workspace on a Sunday morning. This is not what you do 8 days after accepting a proposal." She said she was sorry if the timing felt abrupt, but that she'd been advised. I said, "Advised by whom?" by the son who incorporated a company last month. Gregory started to say something about his professional background. I held up one hand. I took off my apron. I walked to the small desk in the corner of the workshop where I keep a file cabinet. I unlocked it, and I retrieved 2 documents. The first was the corporate registry certificate for the numbered company that owns this property, with my name listed as sole director and sole shareholder. The second was a property tax assessment notice addressed to that company, for this address, for the current year. I placed both documents on the workbench beside Gregory's portfolio. I own this company, I said. I own this property. I own this workshop and the house and this land. I am not a tenant. I am the corporation. The lease arrangement you apparently researched is between me and myself, structured for accounting purposes by my chartered accountant 15 years ago. There is no gap in filing, there is no question of continuity, and there is no leverage here of any kind. The room was very quiet. Fiona's professional composure slipped first. She looked at Gregory and then at her mother, with an expression I can only describe as recalculating. Gregory closed his portfolio. Diane sat down on the wooden stool near the door, the one I keep for clients when they come to discuss a project. She sat down quite suddenly, like her legs had made the decision before she did. I said, I think you and I need to have a very honest conversation, but not today, and not with your children present. Gregory gathered his documents with movements that were too controlled, the kind of careful physical composure people use when they're managing a significant internal response. He and Fiona left without saying much else. I heard a car start in the laneway. Diane and I sat in the workshop for about 20 minutes after that. She tried 3 times to explain. The first explanation was that Gregory had taken initiative without telling her the full extent of what he'd prepared. The second explanation was that she'd been frightened, and that her divorce had left her in a very vulnerable position that she'd never fully recovered from, and that she needed to know she would be protected. The third explanation was a kind of amalgam of the first 2 that didn't hold together any better than either of them separately. I listened to all 3. I asked her one question. Did you know what was in those documents before you walked in here this morning? She didn't answer immediately enough. I told her I needed time. What I did in the following week surprised even me a little. I didn't spiral. I didn't call my children in a panic. I called my lawyer, a woman in Barrie I've worked with for over a decade, and I described the situation. She confirmed what I already knew, that the documents Gregory had prepared were legally ineffective, that nothing had been signed, and that the attempt to use a new numbered company as any kind of lever over my property registration was not grounded in any actual mechanism. Whatever Gregory had been hoping to accomplish, it was not going to work. Then I called my accountant, Martin, who has been filing my corporate returns since before I built the workshop addition in 2003. Martin was characteristically calm. He confirmed everything was in order, reminded me that my corporate filings were current, and noted with dry humor that he was glad I'd called him rather than someone else. Then I called Patrick. My son is a practical man. He said, "Dad, do you love her?" I thought about that for a long time. I said, I thought I did, but I don't know if I knew her well enough to love her. I knew someone I thought was her. Patrick didn't push further. He said, whatever I decided, he and Renee would support it. I asked to meet Diane for coffee on the Thursday of that week, at a cafe downtown that we'd gone to several times before. I chose somewhere public and familiar, which was deliberate. I wasn't angry in any explosive way by that point. I was something quieter and more final, I was clear. I told her that I had given significant thought to what happened in the workshop. I told her that I understood fear and financial vulnerability and the real and legitimate anxiety of a woman who had been hurt before. I had some sympathy for that, and I meant it genuinely. But I told her that what she and her children had attempted, regardless of how much she'd known about the specifics, revealed a fundamental approach to our relationship that I could not move past. She had either participated in, or permitted, a strategy whose entire architecture was built on treating me as a target rather than a partner. I told her that I was withdrawing the engagement. She cried. I believe the tears were real, which made it harder, not easier. Real regret and real disappointment don't change what a thing was. I took back my mother's ring. I had asked for it specifically, and she gave it without argument, which I thought was decent of her. I drove home through Barrie in late afternoon light, and I sat on the back porch of my house for a long time, looking at the workshop. The rosewood sideboard was still on the bench in there, the veneer work half finished. I'd get back to it in the morning. My lawyer sent a brief letter to Gregory's numbered company, informing him that any further communication regarding the property or business would be handled through legal channels. There was no further communication. It took me several months to recalibrate. I kept attending the Tuesday and Thursday sessions at the community center, though it was uncomfortable at first, because Diane attended too for about 6 weeks before she quietly stopped coming. I wish her no harm. I genuinely don't. I think she is a person who was shaped by real financial trauma into someone who makes decisions from fear rather than integrity, and that is a sad way to live. It doesn't make what she did acceptable, but it makes it comprehensible. Gordon, the plumber, my friend from the craft circle, said something to me around November of that year that I've thought about often since. He said, "Walter, you spent 37 years learning to see what wood is actually made of before you invest your time in it. You just forgot to apply the same standard to people." He was right. I'm not writing this story to be dramatic about it, or to invite pity, or to paint myself as some kind of cautionary champion. I'm writing it because I think there are things here worth saying plainly. When you are older, and you have built something over a long life, property, savings, a business, the accumulated security of decades of work, you become, whether you intend to or not, a target for a particular kind of attention. This is not cynicism. It is just a reality that older people, especially those who live alone after a loss, need to hold clearly in their minds. The people who approach you with the most warmth and the most apparent understanding of your loneliness are not always the people they appear to be. Sometimes they are, but the cost of not knowing the difference is high. Background checks are not romantic, but they are reasonable. There are services in Canada that can verify a person's financial history, outstanding liens, and civil litigation record. And for someone who has experienced significant financial difficulty, as Diane had described, those records exist. I did not check. I should have. Common law property rights in Ontario are real and they are complex, and anyone in a long-term relationship should understand them. My corporate structure protected me from consequences I was not even aware were being targeted. Not everyone has that protection. If you are entering a new relationship later in life, talk to your lawyer about what exposure you carry before that relationship deepens. A prenuptial agreement is not an insult. It is a document that honest people who genuinely care for each other can sign without difficulty. The resistance to signing one, or the attempt to establish financial claims through other means before one is even proposed, tells you something important. And finally, go slowly. I know the loneliness of the years after loss. I know how loud it gets at certain hours, and how much a particular person's company can feel like relief. But the desire for companionship can make you rush past evidence that deserves a second look. Carol used to say that the best thing about old furniture was that you couldn't fake the grain. She meant it about more than furniture. By the spring of the following year, I had taken on an apprentice, a young woman named Priya, who had studied art history and wanted to learn traditional restoration work. She is gifted and methodical, and she asks excellent questions, and the workshop is noisier and more alive for her presence. I still attend the Thursday sessions at the community center, though I've drifted from the craft circle toward a photography group that meets in the same building. Last February, I sat beside a woman named Elaine Tremblay, who was learning to develop film in the darkroom the center recently installed. We have had coffee twice since then, in a group with other people around. She is patient and funny, and she asks questions that assume I have a full life worth knowing about, which is an underrated quality. I am in no hurry. The rosewood sideboard was finished in late September of the year all this happened. It sold to a collector in Kingston for considerably more than I expected. The grain, when I got all the old finish off, was extraordinary, deep and complex, and nothing like what the surface had suggested. You never know until you take your time and look properly.